Thank you very much, Elaine. I'm not sure. Certainly I've been to MacGill a number of times, and it tends to get less civilised as the evening goes on, so hang tough. Okay, I'm actually going to start by going a little bit left of field in terms of my paper, because I suppose when I saw the piece that Joe had written kind of as an abstract for this session, because as a sociologist, and I've worked in the area of inequality for 20 years, and I felt, because Joe made reference in the abstract to the broader rise of kind of populism internationally. Obviously, we are in the week that we are in. And I thought I wanted to think about inequality a little bit in those terms to kind of broaden things out. So that's the kind of starting point for what I have to say. So, just to move on there, I'm going to start with a story about inequality from my holidays. So a couple of weeks ago, I was off on my holidays and I was going through the airport and I picked up Vanity Fair. And as you know, you do, and on the plane you want something nice to read. And in Vanity Fair, which had Star Wars on the cover, there was a big article about this guy called Bill McGlashan. Now, Bill McGlashan is a CEO, and he's essentially a hedge funder, an investment funder, and he was involved with Bono in establishing the Rise Fund. Okay? And the Rise Fund is interesting. So essentially, it's a $2 billion investment fund which aims to create social and environmental impact and as a result generate meaningful, measurable and positive change. So I think a very worthy aspiration. The problem for Mr. McGlashan, in terms of, I suppose, the broader aspirations around inequality that are in the Rise Fund, is that he's been caught up in the college admission scandal in the US. So essentially, he's been using his own influence to rig the game. And Vanity Fair were absolutely disgusted with this and very critical of Mr. McGlashan. Just to quote the article, it said, "Any time someone is putting themselves out there as someone who believes in doing good in the world and wanting to make a difference, when allegations are made that they don't live that way in their private life, yeah, you're going to take a lot of heat. The wealthy parents caught up in the admissions scandal took spots that might otherwise have gone to highly qualified students without the resources or inclination to game the system." Now, Bono is apparently furious about this, not surprisingly because of the poor publicity that it generates for the Rise Fund. I have to say, at a personal level, I'm quite surprised because a lot of elite American colleges have essentially built their whole reputation and campus on, supporting their. It's not the most meritocratic admission system in the world within the US, but nevertheless, Bono is extremely annoyed. And in order to understand his annoyance, I think it's interesting to go back to his rationale around the inception of Rise. So essentially, he said, let me just click on here. Can we get this to go forward? Yeah. Okay, so he says, we had this crazy idea that capitalism, this tool that had taken more people out of extreme poverty than any other ism, could be deployed to support the work I was doing, trying to get people out of extreme poverty. Okay? Now, I suppose for many years I have taught courses around globalisation and development, and I suppose one of the things, Bono's extremely cross about this, but one of the reasons that I think I would be cross about this is because we already have a brilliant system linked to capitalism which impacts and lifts people out of extreme poverty, and that system is called taxation. And it seems to me that's the big hole in the structure, not the fact that Mr. McGlashan is off trying to get his kid into the University of Southern California. So as a kind of this whole story started me thinking a little bit more about taxation and its role in kind of perpetuating systems of inequality that we're seeing at a range of geographic levels. And of course, when you start to understand the role of taxation in Ireland and in Europe and in the world, you have to start with neoliberalism and neoliberalism's view of the world. And again, having taught this for tons and tons of years, we increasingly view neoliberalism now as a rationality. It's a way of looking at the world. So it's actually something a little bit bigger even than an economic ideology. And if we trawl through, the works of Hayek and Friedman and von Mises, there's a couple of tenets of neoliberalism that I think are worth restating before we tease through, the link between tax and inequality, etc. So some of these are: the market is based on competition, which is the best mechanism for organising social activities because it encourages choice. Secondly, the individual must be entrepreneurial in how they orient towards the market and live with the consequences of their choices. Welfare safety nets that are too extensive discourage self-reliance and self-responsibility, and the role of the state is to minimise its own involvement in the market and in the lives of citizens. The state ideally gets out of the way. Now, none of these ideas would have had nearly so much impact, I think, even with the influence that they got within banking and within the IMF, if it had not been for the broader macro process of globalisation. So globalisation, which is essentially about connectedness in all its different forms, connectedness of money, markets, people, media, everything. That essentially allowed neoliberalism to get a dominance that I think it couldn't otherwise have managed. And it certainly has had a very significant impact on the distribution of wealth globally. And just to kind of tease through some of the statistics on this, Credit Suisse did a big piece of work for Oxfam in 2018, and I think it's very revealing of where we are in terms of global wealth. So in 2018, the wealth of the world's billionaires increased by $900 billion, that's 2.5 billion a day. At the same time, 26 people owned the same wealth as the 3.8 billion poorest half of humanity. Only 4 cents in every dollar of tax revenue globally collected comes from taxes on wealth, and in a number of countries, the poorest 10% are paying more tax than the richest 10%. One of the most striking features, for somebody like me who kind of wrote a book on the fallout from austerity, is that the way in which the globally wealthy have increased their share of wealth since 2008. So their share of global wealth has increased from 42.5% in 2008 to 50.1% in 2017. And in their conclusion to their report, Credit Suisse identified tax avoidance as one of the main proponents of inequality within global capitalism. This is tax avoidance by wealthy individuals and corporations, which they argued had played a very significant role in deepening and embedding global inequality. Why? Because taxation takes money from the well-off and it spends that money on services and welfare, thus, astonishingly, generating social impact and lifting people out of poverty. So, by enabling tax avoidance, the amount of taxation to spend on these services is reduced. It's, I think, then interesting to look at Ireland and Ireland's role in this bigger pattern. Because I think Ireland's willingness to accommodate global tax avoidance by wealthy individuals and multinational corporations has played a really significant role in generating patterns of distribution that we're looking at. I'm just going to flag through a really interesting piece of research that came out this year. Hang on a minute, I'm going the wrong way. Okay. This is the missing profits of nations. Gabriel Zuckman, he's in Berkeley, Torsley and Weir, 2018. And essentially, these guys described the Republic of Ireland as the world's biggest tax haven. They estimated that in 2015, multinationals shifted $106 billion of corporate profits into the country as a means of avoiding tax. This was more than all the islands of the Caribbean combined, well ahead of Singapore, Switzerland and the Netherlands. They described Ireland as the #1 shifting destination, noting that companies declared $8 profit in the Republic for every $1 spent here on wages. They concluded that profit shifting by multinationals costs tax authorities globally about $200 billion. That's $200 billion that can be spent on schools, hospitals, bridges and roads. Now, not surprisingly, the Department of Finance is extremely critical of this paper, saying that it's oversimplistic. They cite their colleagues in the OECD who basically say a tax haven is a place with a zero tax rate, no transparency or exchange of information, and where multinationals have no real operations on the ground. Now, I actually can hardly think of a country in the world that conforms to that definition of a tax haven, but apparently that's the one they're operating with. Unfortunately, both for the Department and the OECD, the Republic was also described as a tax haven. In the vote to accept a report on tax in the European Parliament this year, a vote which was accepted by 505 votes in favour, 63 against, with 87 abstentions. This is a report by Ludek Niemeyer, who is part of the EPP, and Jeffa Kofod, who is part of S&D. And not only did they highlight Ireland's role in facilitating tax avoidance, but also our continued willingness to use our veto to support digital tax avoidance. Now, I suppose for me, one of the most disappointing things about the debate on corporation tax in Ireland is the very narrow terms in which it has occurred. So by and large, when we look at the discussions of corporation tax in the media, it is, oh no, we're going to be made get rid of our corporation tax. What impact will this have? And some external body is going to do this to us. And so there is really very little unpicking of the bigger moral issues around enabling tax avoidance at a global level. And in this sense, and I see Seamus down there in the audience, it was almost a relief, actually, for the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council, who have come out in recent months and slightly, I think, tried to change some of the tenor of the debate around corporate tax. They highlighted the fact that our corporate tax receipts are bloated from the onshoring of intellectual property. Money is being used to plug spending gaps, particularly in health. I think we're all aware of that. And they argued that the government must wean itself off corporate tax. Corporation tax receipts in Ireland are now a long way from conventional levels and from what underlying performance of the economy would imply. And I think that, from my view, I think what IFAC are actually saying is that we're using corporation tax as a sticking plaster to avoid difficult structural reforms, a sticking plaster to get us out of holes periodically when we find ourselves in them. And I suppose one of the things, aside from this tendency in the way we use corporate tax, one of the things that irritates me about this situation is the way in which we hear, at the moment, Irish politicians often talk quite smugly about the rise of populism in other contexts without ever acknowledging the role that our facilitation of tax avoidance has actually played in creating the underlying patterns that are contributing to the rise of populism. And in this light, I think it's very interesting to look at what Minister Paschal Donoghue said. He gave a very interesting speech at the Valencia Transatlantic Cable Foundation the week before last, where he lamented the rise in nationalism and anti-immigrant sentiment in a number of countries. And he particularly talked about Ireland and said, we refuse to become clone-minded, we refuse to turn against a more diversified Ireland, we refuse to lower moral standards. So we're all right, we're doing fine, and that's great. In some ways, in fairness to Minister Donoghue, he has, and he's spoken about this a number of times, he has really quite a sophisticated understanding of globalisation. This, to me, is the key piece from that speech. It says, much of the recent commentary on globalisation has been framed around winners and losers. While this at times can be a simplistic characterisation of a very complex situation, the point is that there have been people who have not benefited from globalisation in a way that others have. Firstly, from a macro point of view, globalisation has facilitated the mobility of international capital. Money and investment now flows relatively freely across borders, which have wide-ranging implications for labour, productivity, taxation. In particular, the declining labour share of national income is having very significant political implications. This has created a sense of unfairness, of being left behind in some quarters. Indeed, this is part of the reason for the pushback that we have seen against globalisation in recent years. Now, in a sense, this actually mirrors a lot of the stuff that I would have been teaching about globalisation. But unfortunately, it's precisely the lacuna which somebody like President Donald Trump has been exploiting. Here, during the 2016 presidential campaign, in a speech at an aluminum factory in Pennsylvania, he says, guys, globalisation has made the financial elite who donate to politicians very, very wealthy, but it has left millions of our workers with nothing but poverty and heartache. Now, by the way, I'm not championing Donald Trump as an advocate for tax reform, but it's quite clear that some of the changes or some of the patterns within the global economy that have created stresses and tensions, he is exploiting those. Boris Johnson is exploiting those. And this is contributing to some of the changes that we are seeing, I think, internationally, which are very worrying for us in many ways. And I think it's important to highlight the contradiction between this position and these decisions and the broader position that the Irish state is currently adopting in relation to global inequality. There's really no connect between those two positions in their forward to the 2019 report, A Better World. This is Irish Aid. Minister of State Kieran Cannon quotes Miriam MacGill, who talks about, we're a vibrant first world country with a humbling third world memory.
But he also says, we know what it is to be poor, we know what it is to be hungry, we know what it is to migrate for a better life, we know the effort it has taken us for nearly 100 years of independence to build strong institutions. We also know that there's always more to be done. Our experiences as a people are a reminder to us of our responsibility to respond generously to others in need. Now, this is very laudable, and I think it's very sincere, but there is no connect between this position on global inequality and the kind of facilitating decisions and structures that we have put in place in terms of global taxation. So in a sense, just to go back to our friend Bill McGlashan and Vanity Fair and the kind of hypocrisy that they were condemning, at the end of the article they had a very interesting quote from Leo Tolstoy, who says, this is from Winner Takes All, he says, "I sit on a man's back, choking him, making him carry me, and yet assuring myself and others that I'm sorry for him and wish to lighten his load by all means possible, except by getting off his back." I think that is food for thought for us all. Thank you very much.